The Woods. Remember, a true ghost story from Camp Scott. There is an old saying in the deep woods of America: the trees have memories. They remember the sun and the rain, the ring of an axe, the laughter of children, and the whisper of secrets carried on the wind. But they also remember the screams. They remember the darkness that can fall not from the sky, but from the heart of man. If you were to walk today through the overgrown trails and rotting cabins of what was once Camp Scott in Mays County, Oklahoma, you might feel it. A profound and heavy stillness. A silence that isn't empty, but full of a story that has never been allowed to rest. This is that story. It's a true story, which is the most terrifying kind. It's a ghost story, not of clanking chains and spectral apparitions, but of the haunting of memory, of questions that echo unanswered through the decades, and of a place where the purest innocence collided with an unfathomable evil. This is the story of the last night at Camp Scott. Part 1. The Whispers. Before the storm, summer in Oklahoma is a creature of its own. It arrives with a thick, syrupy humidity that clings to your skin, a sun that bleaches the dirt roads white, and the ceaseless, hypnotic thrum of cicadas. For generations of Girl Scouts in the Tulsa area, this symphony of nature was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of Camp Scott, nestled in the rugged, wooded terrain of the Ozark foothills near the town of Locust Grove. Camp Scott was more than just 410 acres of wilderness. It was a sanctuary, a rite of passage. It was a place where city girls and country girls alike came to shed their everyday lives and become, for a few precious weeks, explorers, astronomers, and sisters. They learned to tie knots, paddle canoes, and identify constellations in the vast ink-black sky, unpolluted by city lights. They sang songs around crackling campfires, their voices rising in unison, momentarily chasing away the ancient, watchful darkness of the surrounding forest. The camp was divided into units, each named after a Native American tribe: Cherokee, Choctaw, Kiowa. The girls slept in heavy canvas platform tents, sturdy enough to withstand the sudden, violent thunderstorms that could boil up over the horizon with little warning. These tents were their forts, their clubhouses, their homes. Within these canvas walls, they shared secrets, told ghost stories, and dreamed the simple, untroubled dreams of youth. Camp Scott was, by every definition, a safe place. But in the weeks leading up to the opening of the 1977 season, the woods began to whisper a different kind of story. The pre-camp training session in late May was routine. A group of counselors, teenagers themselves but vested with the sacred trust of leadership, arrived to prepare the grounds. They aired out the tents, cleared the trails, and reacquainted themselves with the familiar rhythms of the camp. During one of these days, a counselor returned to her tent to find it had been violated. Her belongings were strewn about, the contents of her suitcase emptied onto the floor. But it was what was left inside the empty donut box she had been using as a makeshift container that made the blood run cold in her veins. Scrawled on a piece of paper in crude, menacing letters was a note. It was a death threat. It spoke of killing 3 campers. The counselor, terrified, immediately took the note to the camp director. An investigation of sorts was conducted. The scene was examined, questions were asked, but in the end, it was dismissed. A prank, they concluded, a twisted joke by a local troublemaker. The fear was papered over with reassurances. The note was thrown away, its ominous warning discarded like a piece of trash. After all, this was Camp Scott. Such things didn't happen here. The incident was a stone dropped into a pond, and the administration waited for the ripples to subside, never considering what monster had been disturbed in the depths. But the darkness wasn't just in a phantom note. It was a known quantity, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and folklore in the surrounding counties: Gene Leroy Hart. Hart was a local man, a Cherokee who knew these woods and the labyrinthine cave systems that riddled the hills like rotten, toothed mouths. He was also a convicted rapist, a kidnapper, and, as of 1973, an escapee from the Mays County Jail. For 4 years, he had been a ghost, a phantom of the Spavinaw Hills. Law enforcement had hunted him, but he was like smoke, vanishing into the dense forests and dark caves he called home. He was the local bogeyman, a story parents told their children to make them behave. Most believed he was long gone, fled to another state. But some knew better. They knew he was still out there, living off the land, a feral man watching from the shadows. His family's cabin was only a couple of miles from Camp Scott. The camp sat on a powder keg of its own making. There was the ignored threat, a direct warning of what was to come. And there was the bogeyman, a known predator, living on its doorstep. The fuse was lit. All that was needed was the arrival of the children. On Sunday, June 12th, 1977, they arrived. A stream of station wagons and sedans kicked up dust on the long dirt road to the camp entrance. 140 girls, bursting with the chaotic energy of summer's first day. Among them were 3 who, by a twist of fate, would be assigned to tent number 8 in the Kiowa unit, the tent situated furthest from the counselor's tent and closest to the dark, tree-lined edge of the camp. Lori Lee Farmer was 8 years old, the youngest of the 3. It was her first time at sleepaway camp, and she was vibrating with a nervous excitement that was infectious. A local girl from Broken Arrow, she was bright and precocious, the kind of child who makes friends instantly. Michelle Guse, 9, from Tulsa, was the seasoned camper. She was smart, bespectacled, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of a girl who knew the ropes. She had been looking forward to this all year. Doris Denise Milner, 10, also from Tulsa, was the spirited one. She was tough, athletic, and fearless, already an accomplished swimmer. She was the one who would have organized the ghost stories, the one who would have dared the others to sneak out after dark. The 3 girls found each other in the happy chaos of that first day. They claimed their cots in tent number 8, unpacked their bags, and joined in the cacophony of greetings and laughter. They learned the camp song, made lanyards in the craft lodge, and wrote their first letters home, full of the breathless details of their new adventure. As afternoon bled into evening, a change came over the landscape. The sky in the west began to curdle, turning a bruised purple-gray. The air grew heavy and still, the cicadas falling silent as if in anticipation. A storm was coming, a big one. The girls and their counselors gathered in the mess hall for their evening meal, the distant rumble of thunder punctuating their chatter. After dinner, they were hurried back to their units. The camp protocol for storms was clear: stay in your tents. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, the girls of tent number 8 zipped up their canvas door, snuggled into their sleeping bags, and whispered to each other in the growing gloom, their flashlights carving dancing circles on the tent ceiling. The storm was just another part of the adventure, a thrilling, percussive soundtrack to their first night. Outside, the heavens broke open. Rain fell in blinding horizontal sheets, driven by a howling wind. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening celestial violence that shook the ground. Lightning bleached the world white for a split second, etching the writhing trees against the black sky in stark, terrifying relief, before plunging the world back into absolute darkness. The storm was a perfect cover. It masked the sound of footsteps squelching in the mud. It masked the sound of a zipper being slowly, deliberately pulled down. It masked the sound of a heavy canvas flap being pushed aside. And it masked, to all but the trees and the unforgiving night, the sounds of a struggle, the sounds of terror, the sounds that would be stolen by the roar of the wind and the rain. A counselor in a nearby tent, huddled in her own sleeping bag, thought she heard something. A strange noise, a low moan from the direction of tent number 8. But the thunder immediately swallowed it. She dismissed it. It was the wind, she told herself. It was the groaning of the trees. It was her imagination playing tricks on her in the storm-charged darkness. She rolled over and tried to sleep, unaware that she was just 100 feet from a scene of unimaginable horror. She was close enough to be the last person to hear a sign of life, and the first to find only death. The storm raged for hours, a primal fury cleansing the world. Then, as suddenly as it began, it passed. The rain softened to a drizzle and then stopped. The thunder grumbled its way east. A few weary stars poked through the shredded clouds. The camp fell into a deep, exhausted silence. It was a silence that was different now. It was heavier. It was a silence that was a presence, a void where 3 young lives had just been. Part 2. The morning after dawn broke on Monday, June 13th, with a cruel and beautiful clarity. The storm had washed the air clean, and the rising sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the dripping trees. The world smelled of damp earth and pine. It was a morning that should have been filled with the sounds of a waking summer camp, the clang of the breakfast bell, sleepy groans from the tents, the cheerful shouts of girls eager for the day to begin. But the Kiowa unit was quiet. Too quiet. Carla Wilhite, a 19-year-old counselor, was the first to feel it, a gnawing unease that settled in her gut. She had a long walk to the shower house, and on her way back, around 6 a.m., she passed tent number 8. The canvas flap was open, the tent gaping like a silent mouth. Odd, but perhaps one of the girls had gotten up early to use the latrine. She continued on, her unease growing with every step. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. At the counselor's tent, she voiced her concern. Something felt wrong. Another counselor, Susan Emmerich, agreed to walk back with her. They approached tent number 8, calling out the girls' names. Lori, Michelle, Doris, time to wake up. Their voices were swallowed by the woods. There was no reply, no sleepy stirring, no giggled response, just the drip, drip, drip of water from the leaves. Carla reached the tent first. She pushed the flap aside and peered into the dim interior, and the world shattered. What she saw was a scene from a nightmare, a tableau of such profound violence and violation that her mind could barely process it. The idyllic image of 3 little girls in their sleeping bags was gone, replaced by something that would be seared into her memory forever. One sleeping bag was on its cot, but it was stained with a dark, wet color that wasn't mud. Another sleeping bag was on the wooden floorboards, also stained. The third sleeping bag was missing entirely. And then she saw the body. The scream that tore from Carla Wilhite's throat was not human. It was the sound of a soul breaking, a primal shriek of pure, unadulterated horror that ripped through the morning's deceptive peace. It was the alarm bell that signaled the end of innocence for everyone at Camp Scott, and for an entire state. "Get the director!" she shrieked, stumbling backwards, her eyes wide with a terror that would never leave them. "Oh God, get the director!" Chaos erupted. Counselors ran from their tents, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. The camp director, summoned by the screams, arrived and confirmed the horror. The camp's shield of safety had not just been pierced, it had been annihilated. Within minutes, the camp was in lockdown. The remaining campers were hastily gathered, their sleepy faces now etched with a terrifying confusion. They were told there had been an emergency, that they needed to stay in the mess hall. They could hear the counselors crying, their hushed, frantic whispers. They could feel the invisible monster that had crept into their sanctuary. The first to arrive was a local park ranger. He took one look at the scene in tent number 8 and immediately radioed for the Mays County Sheriff's Department. The sheriff's deputies arrived, then the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI. Camp Scott, a place of summer joy, transformed into a sprawling, horrific crime scene. Yellow tape was strung between the pine trees, its garish color an insult to the natural beauty of the place. The search for the third girl began immediately. A line of grim-faced officers and camp staff fanned out into the woods. They didn't have to go far. About 150 yards from the tent, lying near a trail leading deeper into the forest, they found the missing sleeping bag. Inside was the body of 10-year-old Doris Denise Milner. She had been left there, discarded like a broken doll. Lori Lee Farmer and Michelle Guse were found in their own sleeping bags where the killer had left them. They had all been bludgeoned and strangled. Lori Lee Farmer had also been sexually assaulted. The brutality was unspeakable. The crime was an act of pure evil, an invasion so profound it felt like a violation of the natural order. Who could do this? What kind of monster walks into a tent full of sleeping children? As investigators swarmed the scene, a picture of the killer began to emerge from the clues he had left behind. They found a roll of duct tape, a gag, and a flashlight with a partially obscured thumbprint on the lens. They found footprints in the mud, boot impressions leading to and from the tent. They found hairs and fibers that did not belong, and they found the cave. Less than 2 miles from the camp, deep in the woods, investigators followed a trail to one of the area's many small caves. Inside, they found a makeshift lair. There were stolen items, including a newspaper from the day before the murders. There was evidence that someone had been living there, hiding. And on the wall, scrawled in the darkness, were photographs torn from a magazine, pictures of women. It was the den of a predator. The name on everyone's lips was immediate and unavoidable. Jean Leroy Hart, the escaped convict, the local bogeyman, the man who knew these woods like the back of his hand. The manhunt, which had been a low-grade, 4-year-long affair, now exploded into the largest in Oklahoma's history. Hundreds of officers, FBI agents, and local volunteers descended on the Spavinaw Hills. They brought tracking dogs, helicopters, and a burning desire for vengeance. The search was a desperate, dangerous slog through the oppressive heat and treacherous terrain. They scoured the woods, rappelled into sinkholes, and navigated the claustrophobic, pitch-black tunnels of the cave systems. They were hunting not just a man, but a legend, a phantom who had now proven himself to be a monster of flesh and blood. Meanwhile, the soul of Camp Scott died. The buses that had arrived just a day before, full of hope and laughter, returned to take the children home. The scene at the pickup point was one of heart-wrenching grief and fear. Parents hugged their children, their faces pale with the horror of what could have been. And for 3 families, the world had ended. Their station wagons would be going home empty. Camp Scott was closed. The gates were locked. The laughter was silenced. The woods fell quiet again, but it was a haunted quiet now, thick with the memory of the screams the storm had tried to steal. The camp, once a symbol of childhood joy, became a monument to its loss. It would never open again. Part 3. The Trial of the Boogeyman. For 10 long months, the ghost of Jean Leroy Hart taunted Oklahoma. The manhunt continued, a frustrating and fruitless ordeal. Sightings were reported, but he always seemed to be one step ahead, melting back into the wilderness that was his accomplice. The fear he had once inspired as a local legend now became a statewide paranoia. He was everywhere and nowhere, a faceless terror in the public imagination. Then, in April of 1978, the ghost was caught. A tip from a recluse living in a remote cabin in the Cookson Hills, nearly 50 miles from Camp Scott, led authorities to Hart. He didn't put up a fight. The bogeyman wasn't a monster emerging from a cave. He was a tired, gaunt man found in a shack. He was taken into custody, and a wave of collective relief washed over the state. They had their monster. The case against Jean Leroy Hart seemed overwhelming. He was a convicted felon with a history of violence against women. He was an escapee, captured near the scene of the crime. He was a local who knew the terrain intimately. The evidence found in the cave, believed to be his lair, pointed to a disturbed and predatory mind. And then there was the forensic evidence. The OSBI's top forensic scientist, Melvin Hett, presented a compelling narrative. Hairs found on the adhesive side of the duct tape at the scene were, he claimed, a match to Hart. A thumbprint on the flashlight, while smudged, bore similarities. Semen found on Lori Lee Farmer's body was from a man with type A blood, a non-secretor, a combination found in only a small fraction of the population. Jean Leroy Hart was a type A non-secretor. To the public and the prosecution, the puzzle pieces fit perfectly. The district attorney, Sid Wise, was confident. The trial was moved to Pryor, the county seat, and the media descended. It was to be the trial of the century in Oklahoma, a legal proceeding to cage the monster and bring closure to a wounded community. Hart's defense was led by a flamboyant local attorney named Garvin Isaacs. Isaacs knew he couldn't fight the emotion of the case. He had to fight the evidence. He portrayed Hart not as a monster, but as a victim of a biased investigation, a convenient scapegoat for a police force desperate to close a case that had terrified the state. The trial began in March 1979. It was a spectacle of high drama and raw emotion. The families of the victims sat in the front row, their faces a stoic mask of grief, a constant, silent testament to the stakes. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. They presented the threatening note from the counselor training, linking it to Hart's persona even though it had been destroyed. They presented the evidence from the cave, the items stolen from a nearby home. They presented the boots, the flashlight, the tape. And then came Melvin Hett, the star witness, with his seemingly irrefutable hair analysis. He testified that the probability of the hairs belonging to anyone other than Hart was astronomical. But Garvin Isaacs was ready. He began to systematically dismantle the prosecution's case, piece by piece, creating the one thing he needed: reasonable doubt. He attacked the investigation itself. Why was the threatening note thrown away? Why wasn't the crime scene secured more professionally in the initial chaotic hours? He brought in his own forensic experts who cast doubt on Hett's hair analysis, calling it subjective junk science. They argued that hair comparison was not a definitive science like fingerprinting. It was an art of interpretation, and Hett had overstated his certainty. He attacked the timeline. Could one man have overpowered, bound, and murdered 3 girls, moving one of them 150 yards into the woods, all during the height of a ferocious storm, without leaving more evidence and without anyone in the nearby tents hearing a definitive struggle? He brought out a key piece of information. Hart had received a vasectomy years earlier. While this didn't make it impossible for him to produce seminal fluid, it made it highly unlikely he could produce sperm. The samples from the scene contained sperm. The prosecution countered that the vasectomy might not have been successful, but the seed of doubt was planted. Isaacs's most powerful weapon, however, was Hart himself. He painted a picture of Hart as a Cherokee man who was being railroaded by an all-white justice system. He enlisted the help of a respected Cherokee medicine man who attended the trial daily, performing rituals and prayers. This transformed the trial in the eyes of some from a simple murder case into a battle for cultural and racial justice, muddying the waters and creating sympathy for the defendant. The medicine man even claimed to have had a vision that 2 or 3 other men, not Hart, were the real killers. For 30 days, the courtroom was a battlefield of emotion, science, and legal maneuvering. The jury, sequestered and under immense pressure, listened to it all. They saw the grieving parents. They saw the confident prosecutor. They saw the defiant defense attorney. And they saw Gene Leroy Hart sitting impassively, his face a stone mask. On the final day, the jury filed out to deliberate. The town, the state, held its breath. The verdict seemed a foregone conclusion. They had the monster. Justice would be served. After only a few hours, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and handed the verdict to the bailiff. The judge read it aloud. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Gene Leroy Hart, not guilty. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room, followed by a wave of shock and outrage. The parents of the victims collapsed in sobs. The monster had been set free. How could this happen? The evidence, the motive, the man. It had all seemed so clear. But Garvin Isaacs had done his job. He hadn't proven Hart was innocent. He had only proven that the state hadn't proven he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Gene Leroy Hart, however, did not walk free. He was still an escaped convict. He was immediately returned to the state penitentiary in McAllister to serve out the remaining 305 years of his previous sentences. The not guilty verdict was a legal victory, but not a personal one. Just 2 months later, on June 4th, 1979, almost 2 years to the day after the murders, Gene Leroy Hart died in his prison cell of a massive heart attack. He took his secrets, whatever they were, to his grave. For many, his death was a final, frustrating act, robbing them of the chance for a confession that would never come. For others, it was a form of divine justice. But his death didn't answer the question. It only made it permanent. If Gene Leroy Hart didn't do it, then who did? Who was the monster that walked away from Camp Scott and vanished into history? Part 4. The Haunting. The story should have ended there. A tragedy, a flawed investigation, a shocking verdict, a suspect's death. But the ghosts of Camp Scott were not so easily laid to rest. The question, who, became a wound that refused to heal, festering in the heart of Oklahoma for decades. The families of Lori, Michelle, and Doris refused to let their daughters' memories fade. They became tireless advocates for justice, pushing for the case to be re-examined, for new technologies to be applied. They lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn completely without the finality of an answer. Theories swirled for years. feeding the dark folklore surrounding the case. Was it heart, and the jury simply got it wrong? Was it a satanic cult, a popular theory in the 80s? Was it the vision of the medicine man, multiple killers who slipped through the cracks? The empty, rotting cabins of Camp Scott became a pilgrimage site for morbid curiosity seekers, a place where the air was thick with speculation and sorrow. In 1989, a glimmer of hope. The OSBI, spurred by the parents, officially reopened the case. Advances in DNA technology offered the promise of a definitive answer where the science of the 70s had failed. The seminal stains, carefully preserved for over a decade, were subjected to a new round of testing. The community held its breath once more. Now, finally, the truth would be known. The results came back, and they broke everyone's hearts all over again. The DNA tests were inconclusive. The samples were too degraded, too small. They could confirm the presence of male DNA, but they could not build a profile sufficient to either definitively implicate or exonerate Jean Leroy Hart. The ghost remained a ghost. The final door to the truth had been slammed shut. More recently, in 2022, Mays County Sheriff Mike Reed announced another attempt. Using the most cutting-edge technology available, samples were sent for advanced DNA sequencing. The families, now decades older, waited again, their hope tempered by a lifetime of disappointment. In 2023, the results were once again deemed inconclusive, though they did find DNA profiles of at least 2 different males on the evidence. The technology had gotten better, but the evidence was too old, too corrupted by time and the elements. And so the story remains frozen in that moment of horrified discovery on a sunny June morning in 1977. The case is officially closed, yet unsolved. Jean Leroy Hart remains the prime and only suspect in the eyes of law enforcement, but legally, he is an innocent man. The physical place known as Camp Scott is gone. The land was eventually sold, the remaining structures torn down. But the memory of what happened there is now woven into the fabric of the land itself. The woods remember. They remember the laughter and the songs. They remember the storm, and they remember the silence that followed. This is the true horror of the Camp Scott story. It's not just the brutal murder of 3 innocent children. It's the absence of an ending. It's a story without a final chapter, a mystery without a solution. The monster was never truly unmasked, justice was never truly served, and the ghosts were never truly put to rest. They linger in the unanswered questions, in the grief of the families, in the dark history of a place that was meant for light and laughter. And if you listen closely on a humid Oklahoma night, when the wind moves through the pines in that part of the world, you might hear it. Not the sound of children singing, but the echo of a question, whispered over and over again for more than 40 years. A question the trees have held in their memory, but have never been able to answer. Who? The lantern on Devil's Promenade. There are corners of America that time has forgotten, places where the march of progress took one look, shrugged, and moved on. The far northeastern edge of Oklahoma is one such place. It's a land of scrub oak and flinty hills, where the sky is a vast, unforgiving canvas, and the roads are veins of gravel and cracked asphalt running through a sleeping giant. It was here, in this quiet, brooding part of the country, that my career and my sanity nearly met its end. My name is Liam O'Connell, and for 6 years, I was the host of a moderately successful podcast called American Gothic. My trade was folklore, the strange and whispered tales that cling to the periphery of a nation obsessed with the new. I wasn't a ghost hunter or a charlatan. I was a journalist, a folklorist by training, and a skeptic by nature. I dealt in stories, not spirits. My goal was to document the why behind the legends, the social anxieties, the historical traumas, the simple human need to explain the inexplicable. That's what brought me to the tri-state border of Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas. I was chasing a light. They call it the spook light or the Hornet spook light, named for a long-gone town. For over a century, people had reported seeing a single basketball-sized orb of light floating and bobbing down a 4-mile stretch of road, officially designated E50 Road. but known to all locals by its far more evocative name, the Devil's Promenade. The stories were beautifully, archetypally American. Some said it was the ghost of an Osage chief, beheaded by rivals, searching for his lost head. Others, the more romantic version, claimed it was the spirits of two young Quapaw lovers, forbidden from being together, who had leapt to their deaths from a nearby cliff, and now searched for each other for eternity, their souls bound to a single lantern. The most common tale, however, was that of a miner from the old lead and zinc days, whose family was taken by raiders. In his grief, he had taken his lantern and walked into the hills to find them, never to be seen again. His lonely, searching light, they said, was what people saw. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had studied it, of course. Their conclusion was dry, clinical, and utterly boring: temperature inversion. The light, they claimed, was nothing more than the refracted headlights of cars on Route 66, over 10 miles away, distorted by layers of air at different temperatures. A tidy explanation. A scientific bow on a box of rural superstition. And I, Liam O'Connell, was there to document the folklore before the science erased it completely. I arrived in late August, when the Oklahoma heat was a physical presence, a wet, heavy blanket that smothered you the moment you stepped out of the air conditioning. The air hummed with the chitinous rasp of cicadas, a sound so constant it became a form of silence. My first stop was a dusty, cluttered antique shop in the nearby town of Quapaw. The owner was a man named Silas Blackwood, a local historian whose family had been in the area since it was Indian territory. He was a scarecrow of a man, thin and weathered, with eyes the color of a washed-out sky that seemed to see more than you were comfortable with. "The spook light," he said, his voice a dry rustle like leaves skittering across pavement. He polished a silver locket with a cloth, not looking at me. "You city folk love that story." "It's a classic piece of American folklore," I said, turning on my digital recorder. "I'm here to preserve the stories, the legends of the Quapaw lovers, the miner." Silas stopped polishing. He set the locket down with a definitive click and finally met my gaze. His eyes were not unkind, but they were heavy with a knowledge I couldn't yet fathom. "Those are the nice stories, son. The ones we tell the tourists, the ones that make it into the papers." "There are other versions?" I leaned in, my journalistic instincts tingling. This was gold. "Versions?" He gave a short, sharp laugh that was entirely without humor. "There ain't versions of a snake bite. There's the snake, and there's the bite. People think the light is a thing to be seen, a curiosity, like a two-headed calf at the state fair. They park their cars out on the promenade, drink their beer, and wait for the show." He picked up the locket again, his thumb stroking its tarnished surface. "But the light ain't a show. It's a remnant. It's a question that never got an answer. And sometimes it gets tired of asking politely." A shiver, unexpected and unwelcome, traced a line down my spine despite the oppressive heat. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that the road has a memory, and the light is the part of the memory that won't fade. You go looking for it, you're welcome to. But don't you go thinking you're just watching it, because I promise you, son, it's watching you right back." His words hung in the air, thick and dusty as the motes dancing in the sunbeams slanting through his grimy window. It was exactly the kind of ominous local color I was hoping for. I thanked him, paid for a worthless old postcard, and left, feeling smugly satisfied. My story was already writing itself, the hardened skeptic versus the cryptic old-timer, a classic narrative trope. My next stop was to provide the counter-argument. Dr. Evelyn Reed was a geology professor at a small community college in Joplin, Missouri. She had made the spook light her pet project, a perfect real-world example of atmospheric physics for her students. We met in her sterile, brightly lit office, a world away from Silas Blackwood's den of shadows. "It's headlights," she said, tapping a projected map on her wall. The map showed a direct line of sight, albeit a long one, between a specific bend on the Devil's Promenade and a stretch of old Route 66. The topography is perfect for it. You have a low-lying valley between the 2 points. On clear nights, especially when a cool air mass gets trapped beneath a warmer one, you get a superior mirage. The light from the highway headlights is bent downwards by the temperature gradient, making it appear to float and dance right there on the road. It's simple, elegant, and proven. She spoke with the unshakable confidence of a person who deals only in facts. She showed me charts, atmospheric pressure readings, and time-lapse videos that synced the appearance of the spoken light with the passing of trucks on the distant highway. So, the legends, the minor, the Native American spirits? I asked. She smiled, a thin, pitying expression. Mr. O'Connell, people are narrative creatures. We see a strange light. We don't think thermal inversion. We think lost soul. It's more romantic. It's more satisfying. But it's not the truth. She handed me a sheaf of papers. Here's my data. Feel free to use it. Maybe it'll help bring a little bit of reason to this particular corner of the woods. Armed with both sides of the coin, the mythos and the logos, I felt ready. That night, I drove out to the Devil's Promenade. The sun bled out across the horizon in violent strokes of orange and purple, and then darkness fell with an unnerving totality. There were no streetlights, no house lights, nothing but the twin beams of my rental car cutting a tunnel through the inky black. The road was rough, my tires crunching on a loose gravel. I found a pull-off with a good vantage point, a spot recommended by both Silas and Dr. Reed's maps. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was deafening. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was a presence. The thrum of a million insects, the distant, mournful call of a whippoorwill, the rustle of some unseen thing in the tall grass beside the road. The air was thick and smelled of dust and damp earth. I set up my equipment, a high-definition camera on a tripod, a parabolic microphone to capture any strange audio, and my digital recorder for my own notes. For the first hour, nothing. I sat on the hood of my car, sipping lukewarm coffee, feeling the absurdity of it all. A grown man, sitting in the dark in the middle of nowhere, waiting for car headlights to play tricks on him. I started to mentally compose the opening of my podcast episode, a wry, slightly self-deprecating monologue about the lengths we go to for a good story. And then I saw it. It was exactly as described, a single point of light far down the road. It glowed with a warm, yellowish-white luminescence, like an old incandescent bulb. It wasn't bright enough to cast a beam, but it was solid, definite. It hovered about 4 feet off the ground, bobbing gently as if held by an unsteady hand. It swayed from one side of the road to the other, then held still for a long moment before drifting slowly, inexorably, towards me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I fumbled for my camera, focusing the lens. Even through the viewfinder, it was hypnotic. It didn't look like headlights. Headlights are a pair. They cast beams. They move at a consistent speed. This was different. It moved with a strange, organic quality. It would stop, pulse, and then drift again, sometimes shrinking to a pinprick, sometimes swelling to the size of a melon. For a full 10 minutes, it continued its lazy, meandering dance. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, it was gone. The road was plunged back into absolute velvet black darkness. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. A wide, triumphant grin spread across my face. I had it. I had seen the spook light. I had it on camera. The phenomenon was real. Dr. Reed's explanation seemed perfectly plausible. A mirage, a trick of the light. Still, what a trick. My podcast was going to be fantastic. I packed up my gear, my earlier skepticism replaced by the thrill of a successful hunt. I returned the next night. I told myself it was for due diligence, to get more footage. But if I were being honest, a part of me, a small, childish part, just wanted to see it again. It was a beautiful, eerie spectacle. This time, the experience was not the same. I set up in the same spot. The darkness felt heavier tonight, the silence more profound. The air was still, not a leaf stirring. I waited. An hour passed. 2. I was beginning to think it had been a one-time show when it appeared again. But it was closer, much closer. Last night, it had been a distant curiosity. Tonight, it was perhaps only a quarter-mile down the road. The light was brighter, a more intense orange, and it moved with a frantic, agitated energy, zipping back and forth across the road like a trapped firefly. The gentle bobbing was gone, replaced by sharp, erratic jerks. A prickle of unease crawled up my neck. This didn't feel like refracted headlights. This felt wrong. I aimed my parabolic microphone at it, straining to hear anything over the thrum of the cicadas. Nothing. I decided to try something, a little experiment. I flashed my car's high beams once. The light on the road instantly stopped moving. It hung there, motionless, pulsing with a deep, blood-orange glow. My blood ran cold. I flashed them again, 2 quick flashes. The light on the road responded. It pulsed twice, a perfect mimicry. Number, no. That was impossible. A mirage doesn't react. It's physics, not an entity. I was anthropomorphizing, projecting intelligence onto a random phenomenon. My mind was playing tricks on me. I did it again, 3 flashes. The orange orb pulsed 3 times in return. Then it began to move towards me, not drifting this time, but coming at a steady, deliberate pace. This is when the first real tendrils of fear, cold and sharp, pierced my journalistic detachment. I was no longer an observer. I was part of an interaction. The smug satisfaction of the previous night evaporated, replaced by a primal dread. The silence of the night was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. The light was now only a few hundred yards away. I could see that it had no source. It wasn't a lantern. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a free-floating sphere of pure, silent energy. As it grew closer, a new and terrifying detail emerged. The air around me grew cold. The cloying humidity of the Oklahoma night was gone, replaced by a sudden, unnatural chill, the kind of cold that feels like it's coming from inside your bones. My hands, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled with my camera tripod. I needed to get out of there. This had crossed a line from curiosity to threat. I started to break down my equipment, my eyes darting back and forth between my task and the approaching light. It stopped about 100 yards from my car. It just hovered there, at the edge of my headlight's reach, a silent, malevolent orange eye in the crushing darkness. It felt like a predator that had cornered its prey and was now content to simply watch. And then I heard it. It wasn't through the parabolic mic. It was in my own ears. A sound, faint and thin, beneath the noise of the insects. A woman's weeping, a soft, despairing sob that seemed to come from all directions at once. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I threw the last of my gear into the passenger seat, not caring if it broke. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. I twisted it. Click. Nothing. The dashboard lights didn't even flicker. The battery was completely, inexplicably dead. Panic, stark and blinding, seized me. I was stranded on a dark road with a dead car and a thing outside that was impossible and terrifying and watching me. The weeping sound was louder now, closer. It was accompanied by another sound, a man's voice, not speaking words, but muttering in a low, guttural tone of absolute rage and grief. I locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. I stared at the light, which remained perfectly still, its orange glow seeming to mock my terror. The cold inside the car was intense. I could see my breath fogging in front of my face. This is what Silas meant. It gets tired of asking politely. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, a prisoner in my own car. An hour? 2? Time had lost all meaning. The weeping and muttering continued, a maddening, ghostly soundtrack to my ordeal. The light never moved. It just waited. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light vanished. The cold receded, replaced instantly by the thick, hot air of the night. The ghostly sounds faded. I waited a few moments, my body trembling, before I dared to try the ignition again. The engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear, spun the wheel, and tore out of there, spraying gravel in my wake. I didn't slow down until the reassuring, generic lights of the interstate highway were all around me. I spent the rest of the night in my motel room, the lights on, the television blaring, trying to rationalize what had happened. A dead battery, coincidence, the sounds, auditory pareidolia, the brain creating patterns from random noise, the light responding to me, my own confirmation bias. I clung to Dr. Reed's science like a drowning man clings to a splinter of wood. It had to be headlights. It had to be. but I couldn't shake the cold or the feeling of being watched. The next day, I went to see Silas again. He took one look at my pale face and the dark circles under my eyes and simply nodded. "It showed you," he said. It wasn't a question. I shakily recounted the events of the previous night, the light's response, the dead battery, the sounds. I left out the cold, afraid it would make me sound insane. He listened patiently, his ancient eyes never leaving my face. When I was done, he sighed. "The miner," he said softly. "Jedediah. That was his name, the one I heard from my granddaddy. He didn't just lose his family. He found what was left of them. The raiders. They weren't kind. What he found in that cabin broke his mind. He took his pickaxe and his lantern and went hunting. They say he found them. They say he did things to them that made the devil himself look away. When it was done, he just kept walking, crazed with grief and bloodlust. He died out there in those hills, but his rage, it stayed. It soaked into the ground. It stained the dark." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "And the Quapaw girl, Nali. She didn't jump with her lover. He was killed by her own tribe for wanting to be with her. In her sorrow, she ran into the night to find his body holding a torch, but she got lost. She ran all night, weeping, searching. They say she ran right into Jedediah the miner on that same road. He wasn't in his right mind. He saw a flicker of light, another person in his hills, and his rage just boiled over." My blood turned to ice, the weeping, the enraged muttering. It wasn't two stories, it was one. A horrific, tragic collision of grief and madness on a lonely stretch of road. "The light isn't one soul, son," Silas said, his voice trembling with the weight of the tale. "It's three. It's the miner's hateful lantern, forever searching not for his family, but for victims. And it's the spirits of Nali and her warrior, trapped in his orbit, forever trying to find each other, forever replaying their terror. The miner's rage holds them there. He guards that road, his promenade." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not a cryptic old man, but a profoundly sad and frightened one. "Most nights, you just see the glow, the echo. That's the refracted headlights, maybe. A natural thing that wears the mask of a supernatural one, a comfortable lie. But sometimes, when someone is too curious, too loud, the mask comes off. The real memory of the place wakes up, and it remembers what happened there. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags, deleted my recordings, and driven east until I hit the ocean. Any sane person would have, but I wasn't sane anymore. I was an addict who had tasted a drug more potent than any other, a truth that defied explanation. I was a journalist with the story of a lifetime, and the hubris that had brought me here was still, somewhere deep inside, screaming for a conclusion. I had to go back, one last time. I had to get proof. I had to record the sounds. It was the single, stupidest decision of my life. That night, the air was different. A storm was brewing on the horizon, and the air was charged with a tense electric quality. The sky was a bruised purple. I didn't park at the pull-off. I left my car a mile down the road and walked into the heart of the Devil's Promenade on foot, armed with only my best audio recorder and a heavy-duty flashlight. I was no longer an observer. I was offering myself up as bait. For a long time, there was nothing but the rising wind and the distant rumble of thunder. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight. Then, a pinprick of orange light appeared down the road. I stood my ground, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I held up the recorder. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and pathetic. The light began to move towards me faster than before. The weeping started, a stereo of sorrow in my ears. The angry muttering followed, a bass note of pure hatred. The light was 100 feet away, 50. The cold was so intense it felt like my skin was burning. I could see everything in stark, horrifying detail. This was no orb. It was a gnarled, furious knot of light, the color of a dying fire. And within it, I could almost see a shape, a stooped figure, a man holding it aloft. Then behind it, two other fainter lights appeared, pale and bluish white. They darted and weaved around the central orange glow, like moths drawn to a flame they desperately wanted to escape. This was it. The miner, the lovers, all of them. The whole damn tragedy playing out right in front of me. The orange light was now just 20 feet away. I could feel the rage coming off it in waves, a psychic pressure that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. The face of the miner, Jedediah, flashed in my mind, a mask of dirt and beard with eyes like hollowed-out coals burning with an insane fire. I felt his grief, his loss, and the bloody satisfaction of his revenge. Then I felt Nali's terror, her frantic, hopeless search, and her final, agonizing moment of meeting the wrong person in the dark. The story wasn't a legend. It was a scar, and I was pressing on it with all my weight. I screamed. I don't know what I screamed, just a raw, animal sound of pure terror. I turned and ran. I ran blindly, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly, illuminating twisted trees and menacing shadows. The weeping was right behind me, in my ears. The muttering was a growl at my back. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the cold, a moving pocket of spectral winter chasing me. I could feel the orange light on my neck. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, my lungs on fire, my legs screaming. I burst out of the tree line near my car, fumbled for my keys, my hands refusing to obey. The weeping was now a full-blown shriek. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The orange light was hovering at the edge of the road, right where I had emerged. It didn't follow me further. It just stopped, pulsing slowly. The two smaller blue lights flickered desperately around it. It was watching me go. It was letting me go. It had shown me what I had asked to see. I got the car started and drove. I drove all night, fueled by adrenaline and terror. I didn't stop until the sun was up, and I was 2 states away. I released the podcast episode. I used the footage from the first night, the audio of Silas, the interview with Dr. Reed. I presented it as a fascinating case study in folklore and physics, a place where science and legend intersect. I concluded that the light was, in all likelihood, a beautifully persistent atmospheric mirage that had inspired some truly wonderful American myths. I lied. I never told anyone what happened on the second and third nights. The audio from my final trip was unusable. Nothing but wind, my own ragged breathing, and a high-frequency static that gave me a migraine whenever I tried to listen to it. But sometimes, when I'm working late and the house is quiet, I think I can hear, buried deep within that static, the faint sound of a woman crying. I don't chase ghosts anymore. My podcast is over. I have a desk job now in a city full of light and noise. I've come to understand that there are 2 kinds of truth in this world. The kind you can prove with data and charts, and the kind that leaves you with a dead car battery and a cold that follows you home. Some stories aren't meant to be fully told. Some darkness isn't meant to be illuminated. And out on a lonely stretch of road in Oklahoma, a lantern still burns, held by a rage that never cooled, forever trapping the innocent in its glow. It's not looking for anything. It's just waiting. Don't go looking for it. Trust me, you might just find it. The Shadow of the Green Country. Prologue. The Inheritance. Jedediah. Jed Calloway never considered himself a countryman. He was born in the concrete heartbeat of Tulsa, raised on the rhythm of traffic and the electric hum of a city that never truly slept. The woods were something you saw from a car window on the way to a designated campsite, a tamed and cataloged version of the wild. But life has a cruel way of rewriting your story. When his wife, Sarah, was taken by a swift and merciless cancer, the city's heartbeat became a funeral drum. Every street corner held a memory, every restaurant a ghost. The noise was no longer a comfort, it was an accusation. He needed silence. He needed an escape. The escape came in the form of a letter from a lawyer's office in a town he'd barely heard of, Salina, Oklahoma. His great-uncle, a man he remembered only as a grizzled, quiet figure from a handful of childhood holidays, had passed away. Elias Calloway had been a recluse, a man who had long ago traded human company for the society of oak and hickory trees. He had left Jed his only possession of value, 40 acres of dense woodland and a small, sturdy cabin nestled deep within it, right in the heart of what the locals called green country. It felt like Providence, a sanctuary, a place to let his grief breathe and dissipate into the leaves. Within a month, Jed had sold his house in Tulsa, packed his life into a pickup truck, and driven east, toward the rolling, rugged hills of the Ozark Plateau. The cabin was exactly as he'd pictured it, though more weathered, built from thick, dark logs, with a wide front porch and a stone chimney that looked like it had grown out of the earth. It sat in a small clearing, but the forest pressed in on all sides, a monolithic wall of green and brown. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet perfume of pine. For the first time in months, Jed felt a flicker of peace. The silence here wasn't empty. It was full of the whispers of the wind, the chittering of squirrels, and the distant call of a hawk. It was a living silence. He spent the first few weeks settling in, a process that was more about healing than housekeeping. He learned the rhythm of the land. He learned that the woods weren't just a wall of trees, but a complex, interconnected world. He'd walk the property line every morning, a thermos of coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of orange and violet through the canopy. He saw deer moving like ghosts in the morning mist, heard the gobble of wild turkeys, and once saw a bobcat slink across the trail, its movements a perfect marriage of grace and menace. He was an observer, a guest in a kingdom that had existed long before him. He was also, he came to realize, completely and utterly alone. The nearest paved road was 2 miles down a rutted dirt track. His closest neighbor was a man named Silas Blackwood, a Cherokee elder who lived another 3 miles down that road and whose family had been in the area for generations. Jed met Silas during his first trip into Salina for supplies. The old man was sitting on a bench outside the general store, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his long gray hair tied back in a neat ponytail. He watched Jed load bags of flour and cans of beans into his truck with eyes that seemed to see more than just the surface. "You're Elias's boy," Silas said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "His great-nephew, Jedediah," Jed corrected, extending a hand. Silas took it. His grip was surprisingly firm. "Silas Blackwood, your uncle was a good man, knew how to listen." "He was quiet, that's for sure," Jed said with a small smile. Silas's gaze drifted towards the hills, the direction of Jed's cabin. "This land requires listening. It has a voice. Not everyone knows how to hear it anymore. Elias did. He knew the difference between the wind in the pines and the wind that carries a warning. He knew the track of a deer and the track of something else." Jed raised an eyebrow. "Something else?" Silas didn't elaborate. He just gave a slow nod. "The woods are deep, Jedediah, deeper than you think, and older. There are things in them that were here before the towns, before the roads, before the first white man ever saw these hills. They keep to themselves mostly. You show them respect, they'll show you the same. You mind your space, they'll mind theirs." Jed chalked it up to local folklore, the kind of spooky tale old-timers tell to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. He thanked Silas for the advice and drove back to his sanctuary, the old man's words a curious, fleeting thought. He would soon learn they were not folklore. They were a survival guide. Part 1. The Unraveling of Silence. The first sign was subtle, easily dismissed. It was a late afternoon in October, the air crisp and the leaves a riot of crimson and gold. Jed was splitting firewood near the edge of the clearing, the rhythmic thwack of the axe, a satisfying percussion against the quiet of the woods. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow and caught a sound that was out of place. It wasn't the call of a bird or the rustle of a squirrel. It was a sharp, percussive crack. It sounded like a heavy branch being snapped deliberately. It came from deep in the woods to the north, far off his property. He waited, listening. A few moments later, an answer came from the west. Another crack, just as sharp, just as loud. A hunter, he thought. Maybe two, signaling each other. Still, it was odd. It wasn't the sound of a gunshot. It sounded more primitive. He shrugged it off and went back to his work, but a small, persistent seed of unease had been planted. A week later, he found the tracks. He was on his morning walk along a creek that marked the western boundary of his land. The muddy bank was a ledger of the night's activities, the delicate prints of raccoons, the cloven hoof marks of a doe and her fawn, the paw prints of a coyote. And then something else. It was a single partial print, pressed deep into the mud near the water's edge. It was enormous. It had the basic shape of a human foot, but it was impossibly wide at the ball, with 5 distinct, thick toes. It was at least 16 inches long, even with the heel obscured. Jed wore a size 11 boot. He placed his foot next to the print, and it was dwarfed. The sheer depth of the impression spoke of immense weight. He stared at it, his mind racing through possibilities. A bear? Number A bear track is distinct, with claw marks and a different shape. This was humanoid. A prank? Who would come all the way out here, to this specific, secluded spot, to stamp a fake footprint in the mud? The idea was absurd. He took a photo with his phone, the image looking surreal even on the small screen. He spent the rest of the day feeling a prickle on the back of his neck, the unnerving sensation of being watched. The woods no longer felt like a sanctuary. They felt like a territory, and he was an intruder. The nights began to change. The living silence he had come to cherish was now filled with a new tension. He'd lie in bed, listening. He started to discern sounds he'd never noticed before. A low moan that seemed to ride on the wind, too deep and guttural to be an owl or a coyote. Sometimes he'd be jolted awake by a sudden, heavy thud against the outside wall of the cabin, as if a large animal had brushed against it. He'd grab the heavy-duty flashlight he kept by the bed, his heart hammering in his chest, and shine it out the window, but he never saw anything. There was only the silent, unmoving wall of trees, swallowing the beam of light. One evening, the smell came. It was the most vile, offensive odor he had ever encountered. It was a thick, gag-inducing mix of rotten meat, wet fur, and something musky and primal, like a cage at the zoo that hadn't been cleaned in a year. It rolled into the clearing on a breeze, so potent it made his eyes water. It lingered for nearly an hour and then vanished as quickly as it had arrived. He checked for dead animals around the cabin the next morning but found nothing. The smell had no source and no explanation. Jed was a rational man. He tried to rationalize. The wood knocking was woodpeckers or falling branches. The track was a misidentified bear print, distorted by the mud. The sounds in the night were the wind, or his grief-addled mind playing tricks on him. The smell was a dead deer hidden somewhere in the dense underbrush. But the explanations felt thin, fragile things against the growing weight of the evidence. He drove into Salina and found Silas Blackwood in the same spot, as if he were a permanent fixture of the town. Jed showed him the picture of the footprint on his phone. Silas looked at the image for a long time, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, a slow, heavy gesture. "I told you," he said softly. "There are things in the woods older than us." "What is it, Silas?" Jed's voice was strained. "A bear? Some kind of hermit playing a sick joke?" "Neither," Silas said, his eyes meeting Jed's. "The old ones in my family, they have a name for it. Sul Kalu, the slanting-eyed giant. A spirit of the forest. Not good, not evil. Just is. It has always been here. It guards the mountains, the deep places. It doesn't like to be seen. It doesn't like to be crowded." "A spirit? Silas, I saw a footprint. Something physical made that." "Spirit, creature. What's the difference?" Silas gestured to the forested hills. "You think because you have a deed from the county courthouse that you own that land? That paper is a suggestion, an agreement between your kind. He doesn't read paper. He reads the seasons. He reads your intent. Your Uncle Elias knew this. He lived there for 50 years. He left food out sometimes, an apple, a handful of corn. He never carried a gun on his own property. He never went looking. It was a treaty of silence. He stayed in his clearing, and the old man stayed in his woods." Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. A treaty of silence. A treaty he had unknowingly violated simply by existing. "What does it want?" Jed asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It wants what it has always wanted," Silas replied, his gaze distant. "To be left alone. It's watching you, Jedediah. It's testing you, trying to figure you out. The knocking, the smell. Those are warnings. They are questions." Who are you? Why are you here? Are you a threat? How do I answer? By listening, Silas said, like your uncle did, by showing respect, and by understanding that you are never, ever truly alone out there. Jed drove back to the cabin, Silas's words echoing in his mind. Sul Kalu, the slanting-eyed giant. It sounded like something from a forgotten myth, but the fear it inspired in him was terrifyingly real. That night, he didn't just hear a sound, he heard a voice. It came from the direction of the creek, a long, mournful, two-toned call that was part howl, part scream. It was a sound of immense power and profound loneliness, and it vibrated through the log walls of the cabin and into his very bones. It was the sound of a king proclaiming his domain, and Jed knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, that he was sleeping in the heart of it. Part 2. The Siege. The change was palpable. The warnings were no longer passive. They were becoming active. The line between Jed's world and the creature's world was blurring, and the creature was the one doing the crossing. Jed, against Silas's advice, let his fear curdle into a stubborn, defensive anger. This was his home. He had fled the ghosts of the city, only to be haunted by a flesh-and-blood monster in the woods. He wouldn't be chased off. He bought a game camera, determined to get proof, to capture a definitive image of his tormentor. He strapped it to a large oak tree overlooking the creek bed where he'd found the track. The first week, the camera captured exactly what he expected. Ghostly images of deer at dawn, a portly raccoon investigating the lens with its nose, a spectral barn owl swooping past in a blur of white feathers. Then, on the 8th night, he got something else. The camera was triggered at 3:14 a.m. The image was black, not blurry, not out of focus, utterly, completely black. He checked the next photo, taken 1 second later, also black, and the next. He scrolled through a sequence of 30 photos, all taken seconds apart, all perfectly black. The final photo in the sequence, however, was of the creek bed, exactly as it should be, but the camera itself was now aimed at the sky. It took him a moment to understand. Something hadn't just walked past the camera. It had approached it, covered the lens with a hand or a swatch of fur, and then deliberately twisted the entire unit upwards. The intelligence of the act was more terrifying than any photo could have been. It knew what the camera was, and it didn't want its picture taken. His fear now had an edge of paranoia. He began to feel like a prisoner in his own cabin. He stopped his morning walks. He only went outside during the brightest part of the day to get firewood or work on his truck. The woods were no longer a place of solace. They were a place of constant, oppressive surveillance. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent his heart into a frantic rhythm. He'd be reading on the porch in the late afternoon and would be overcome with the chilling, primal certainty that a pair of eyes was fixed on him from the deep shadows of the tree line. He'd snap his head up, but there was never anything there, just the trees, watching and waiting. The rock throwing started a few days later. It was dusk, that liminal time when the world bleeds from color into shades of gray. He was inside, washing dishes, when a loud clack echoed from the side of the cabin. It sounded like a baseball hitting a wooden wall. He froze, soap-covered hands suspended over the sink. He waited. A minute later, another clack, this time on the metal roof, the sound sharp and ringing. He grabbed his flashlight and his .30-06 rifle, a gun he'd brought for hunting but now saw as his only line of defense, and crept to the door. He flung it open, sweeping the beam of the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. The air was still. The woods were silent. Too silent. The normal chorus of crickets and frogs was gone. It was a dead, listening silence. Then, from the darkness just beyond the reach of his light, a small rock, about the size of a fist, arced through the air and landed with a soft thud in the dirt, not 10 feet from him. It wasn't a random act. It was a message. I'm here. I see you. This is my throw. The next one will be bigger. Jed didn't shout or fire a warning shot. He was too scared. He backed into the cabin, bolted the door, and spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair facing the door, the rifle across his lap, listening to his own ragged breathing and the suffocating silence of the forest. The final illusion of safety shattered the following week. He had to make a supply run, a trip he now dreaded, as it meant leaving his fortified cabin and returning to it, possibly in the dark. He made sure to get back well before sunset. As he pulled his truck into the clearing, something was wrong. The heavy wooden rocking chair he kept on the porch was gone. His first thought was a human thief, but that made no sense. The chair was old, heavy, and not worth much. Nothing else was touched. He scanned the clearing, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. And then he saw it. The rocking chair was sitting in the middle of the trail, leading into the woods, about 50 yards from the cabin. It was placed perfectly, facing the cabin, as if someone had been sitting there, watching the house, waiting for him. This was no longer a warning. This was a statement of power. I can come right up to your door. I can take your things. I can be here whenever I want. This clearing is not yours. Jed's sanity began to fray at the edges. Sleep offered no escape, as his dreams were filled with towering, shadowy figures and the feeling of being pursued through an endless, suffocating forest. He lost weight. His eyes were constantly wide, scanning the tree line. The city boy who had come to the woods for peace was being unmade by them, ground down by a slow, methodical psychological warfare waged by an enemy he couldn't see. He knew he should leave. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to pack his truck and never look back. But a deeper, more stubborn part, perhaps the same part that had belonged to his reclusive great-uncle, refused. This was the last piece of his family, the last sanctuary he had. Fleeing felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory, an admission that he couldn't even build a new life for himself. He was caught between the ghost of his past and the monster of his present. He decided to make one last stand. He bought powerful, motion-activated floodlights and installed them on all four corners of the cabin. He reinforced the locks on the doors and windows. He cleared the brush from the immediate perimeter of the clearing, creating a wider field of fire, a no man's land. He was turning his peaceful retreat into a fortress. The night he finished, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned a bruised greenish black. The wind began to howl, not with the voice of the creature, but with the raw fury of nature. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, the power grid, fragile in this rural area, gave out. The cabin was plunged into a sudden, profound darkness. Jed's heart seized. The storm, the darkness, it was the perfect cover. He lit a kerosene lamp, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel vast and threatening. The rain came down in sheets, a deafening roar on the metal roof. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it shook the very logs of the cabin. And in a brief silence between thunderclaps, he heard it. A heavy, wet footstep on the wooden boards of his front porch. Thump. Jed froze, the rifle in his hand suddenly feeling like a child's toy. Thump. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of immense weight settling onto the wood. It was no longer hiding in the woods. It was at his door. He heard the sound of sniffing, a series of deep, wet inhalations right at the main door. Then a low, guttural rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate up from the floorboards into the soles of his feet. It was a sound of pure, animalistic curiosity and menace. His mind went blank with terror. He was trapped. The storm was a roaring monster outside, and a different kind of monster was on his porch. He backed away from the door, aiming the rifle with trembling hands. The brass doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Jed let out a strangled cry. The knob twisted back and forth, testing the lock. The intelligence, the mimicry of a human action, was the most horrifying thing of all. This wasn't just an animal. It knew what a door was. It knew how it worked. When the knob failed to yield, a new sound began. A deep, frustrated growl, and then a scratching at the door itself. Not the light scratch of an animal, but the heavy, splintering sound of thick, powerful fingernails gouging deep into the wood. Jed retreated further into the cabin, his back hitting the cold stone of the fireplace. The scratching stopped. A heavy silence descended, made more profound by the roaring storm. He waited, his ears straining, his every nerve screaming. Boom! A fist, or something like it, slammed into the wall next to the window. The entire cabin shuddered. A framed photo of him and Sarah rattled and fell to the floor, the glass shattering. The sound broke his paralysis. This thing was trying to get in. It was trying to break his home, his world, apart. Another boom, this time on the heavy wooden shutters he'd closed over the window. He could hear the wood groaning, splintering under the assault. And then it came, the true voice of the creature, not from the distance of the woods, but from right outside his wall. It was a full-throated, deafening roar of rage and frustration. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. A sonic wave of pure, unadulterated predatoriness. It was the sound of a god of this forgotten place, enraged at the tiny, soft thing that dared to lock a door against it. In that moment, a bolt of lightning lit up the world outside, turning night into a split second of stark, brutal day. Through the thin gap between the splintering shutters, Jed saw it. It was only a glimpse, a nightmarish flash frame, but it was burned into his mind forever. He saw a massive, broad shoulder covered in thick, matted, dark, reddish-brown hair, slick with rain. He saw the side of a sloping, conical head, and he saw an eye, large, dark, and intelligent, but not humanly intelligent. It was the ancient, cold, calculating eye of a predator, and it was looking right at him. The lightning faded, plunging him back into darkness, but the image remained, seared onto the backs of his eyelids. Jed screamed. It wasn't a word, just a raw, tearing sound of ultimate terror. He raised the rifle, his finger on the trigger, aiming blindly at the shuttered window. He was about to fire, to unleash a bullet into the storm and the monster it concealed. But then, a memory of Silas's voice cut through his panic. "You show them respect, they'll show you the same." Firing that gun wouldn't be an act of defense. It would be a declaration of war, a violation of the final taboo. It would be an answer to the creature's question, and the answer would be, "I am a threat." His finger eased off the trigger. He lowered the rifle, shaking uncontrollably. He sank to the floor, huddled against the fireplace, and did the only thing he could. He listened. He listened to the storm, to the creature's angry grunts, and the occasional terrifying thud against the walls. He listened, and he waited for the dawn. It was the longest night of his life, a waking nightmare spent in the company of a monster. Epilogue: The Return. The dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid of what it might reveal. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, glinting off the wet leaves. Jed was still on the floor, stiff and cold, the rifle still in his hands. He hadn't slept. He hadn't moved. He had simply endured. With the light came a fragile, tentative courage. He rose on shaky legs and crept to the door. He peered through the peephole. Nothing. He slowly unbolted the lock and pulled the door open. The porch was a scene of violation. Deep, five-fingered gouges were torn into the door and the wall beside it. A muddy, enormous footprint, larger than any he had seen before, was stamped onto the boards, a clear and final calling card. The wooden shutter on the front window was cracked down the middle, hanging precariously from one hinge. But the creature was gone. As the sun rose higher, the normal sounds of the forest slowly returned, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects. The world was pretending it was a normal day. But Jed knew it wasn't. Nothing would ever be normal again. The treaty his uncle had maintained for 50 years was shattered beyond repair. He had seen the face of the old man of the woods. He had heard his voice and felt his rage. He knew now that he wasn't a homeowner. He was an occupant in a territory that was not, and could never be, his. The peace he had sought in the silence of the woods was a lie. The silence was not peace. It was merely the bated breath of the wild. He didn't pack slowly. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy. He threw what he could into his truck: clothes, the photo of Sarah, his rifle. He didn't bother with furniture or kitchen supplies. He left the kerosene lamp on the table. He left the cabin as it was, a monument to his failed escape. He didn't stop in Selena. He didn't say goodbye to Silas. The old man already knew. He would see the empty cabin, and he would understand. Jed just drove. He drove west, away from the green country, away from the Ozark Plateau, away from the deep, dark woods that held their ancient secrets. Jed Calloway lives in an apartment in Oklahoma City now. It's small and anonymous, and the constant hum of the city is a comfort. The sounds are man-made, predictable. He can hear his neighbors through the walls, the blare of a car horn, the distant wail of a siren. These are the sounds of his own kind. But sometimes, on a quiet night, when the wind blows from the east, he imagines he can smell it. A faint, musky odor of damp fur and primordial earth. He looks out his window, not at a wall of watching trees, but at the sprawling electric glow of the city. He knows he is safe here, but he also knows, with a certainty that will haunt him for the rest of his days, that he is not safe because he escaped. He is safe because he was allowed to leave. He was an intruder who had been tested, terrified, and ultimately evicted. And he knows that deep in the green heart of Oklahoma, in the living silence under the ancient canopy, the shadow still walks. It watches, it listens, and it waits for the next soul who comes seeking peace, unaware that they are trespassing in the kingdom of the green country Bigfoot. Echoes in the Sans Bois, the vanishing of the Jameson family. Introduction: the Silent Mountain. There are places in America, tucked away in the folds of old maps and older memories, that seem to hold a breath. They are pockets of profound, unnerving silence, where the modern world's frantic hum fades to a whisper, then to nothing at all. The Sans Bois Mountains in southeastern Oklahoma are one such place. The name, a legacy of French trappers, means without woods, a stark misnomer for the dense, tangled forests of oak and pine that claw their way up the rugged slopes. These are ancient hills, steeped in tales of Native American spirits, outlaw hideouts, and things that stir in the deep, starless nights. It's a land that keeps its secrets well, and in October of 2009, it would claim another. This is not a story with a neat conclusion. It is not a puzzle with a final satisfying click of a piece falling into place. This is a story of a void, a sudden, chilling emptiness where a family used to be. It's a tale that begins with an abandoned truck on a lonely dirt road and spirals into a labyrinth of paranoia, spiritual warfare, and a darkness that seems to have seeped up from the very soil of the mountains themselves. This is the story of Bobby, Sherilyn, and 6-year-old Madison Jameson, a family that drove into the heart of the Oklahoma wilderness and simply vanished, leaving behind only echoes and a single, terrifying question: what evil befell them in the shadow of the Sans Bois? Part 1. The Discovery. On October 8th, 2009, a deer hunter named Alvy Carlisle was navigating the labyrinthine network of oil and gas lease roads that snake through the Panola Mountain area, a particularly remote section of the Sans Bois Range. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The landscape was a mosaic of rust and gold, beautiful but unforgiving. It was not a place one stumbled upon by accident. You had to have a reason to be this far out. That's why the white 2003 Ford F-150 pickup struck him as so profoundly wrong. It was parked awkwardly on the side of the dirt track, nose pointed slightly downhill, as if the driver had stopped in a moment of indecision and never made another. It was coated in a fine layer of red dust, and fallen leaves had begun to collect around its tires. It looked dormant, abandoned. Carlisle, a man accustomed to the rhythms of the wilderness, felt a prickle of unease. He circled the vehicle. The doors were locked. He peered through the driver's side window, cupping his hands to block the glare. The cab was messy, but it was the messiness of a family on a trip. Maps, empty water bottles, a child's sweater tossed on the seat. He saw a cell phone, then another. A wallet lay open on the dashboard, cash visible inside. A GPS unit was still mounted to the windshield. This was not a robbery. Then he heard it, a faint, desperate scratching sound from inside the truck. His heart hammered against his ribs. He moved to the back, peering into the pickup's extended cab, and his eyes met those of a dog. It was a small, emaciated creature, its ribs starkly visible beneath a coat of matted fur. It was Maisie, the family's beloved pet, and she was starving, whimpering with a mixture of fear and a sliver of hope at the sight of a human face. The sight of the dog, trapped and wasting away, transformed the scene from merely strange to deeply alarming. People don't just abandon their vehicle in the middle of nowhere, leaving behind their money, their identification, and their dog to die. Alvy Carlisle knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that something terrible had happened. He retreated from the silent truck and its desperate occupant and drove until he found a signal to call the Latimer County Sheriff's Office. When Deputy Sheriff Israel Beauchamp arrived, the scene only grew stranger. He managed to get the truck open and was immediately hit by the stench of a starving animal. Maisie was weak but alive, a small, furry ghost in the silent cab. The inventory of the truck's contents read like a checklist of a life abruptly paused. Bobby Dale Jameson's wallet was there. Sherilyn Jameson's purse was on the floor, her ID inside. Their cell phones were present, and tucked away in a bank bag under the driver's seat was the most baffling discovery of all: $32,000 in cash, neatly bundled stacks of $100 bills. Why would a family, seemingly on the brink of poverty, be carrying a treasure trove of cash? And why, in a moment of crisis, would they leave it all behind? Deputy Beauchamp scanned the surrounding area. There were footprints, 2 sets of adult prints and a smaller set, a child's, leading away from the truck and up a small hill. But they simply stopped. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no discarded clothing. It was as if the 3 of them had walked a few paces up the path, taken a collective breath, and been erased from the face of the earth. The silence of the mountains, which had seemed peaceful to the hunter, now felt predatory. It had swallowed a family whole. The search for the Jamesons had begun. Part 2, The House of Whispers. To understand what might have happened on that lonely mountain road, one must first step inside the Jamesons' home on the shore of Lake Eufaula, about 30 miles from where their truck was found. Because the darkness that consumed them didn't begin in the woods. Its roots were firmly planted within the 4 walls of their house. Bobby Dale Jameson, 44, was a man worn down by life. A severe car accident years prior had left him with chronic, debilitating back pain. This pain was a constant, grinding presence in his life, affecting his mood, his ability to work, and his relationship with his family. His conversations with his mother, Starlet, were often dominated by complaints about the pain and the perceived indifference of his father, Bob Jameson Sr. This friction with his father was a deep, festering wound, culminating in Bobby penning a venomous 11-page letter, which police would later find in the abandoned truck. It was a screed filled with accusations and rage, a testament to a man at war with his own family and perhaps his own demons. Sherilyn Jameson, 40, was a woman of sharp intelligence and fragile mental health. She suffered from bipolar disorder, a condition that sent her spiraling between manic highs and crushing depressive lows. Her family described her as a loving mother to her daughter, Madison, but also as someone increasingly detached from reality. In the months leading up to the disappearance, her behavior had grown more and more erratic. She had become obsessed with spirituality, but not of a conventional kind. Her friends and family spoke of spiritual warfare. Sherilyn believed their home was haunted. She claimed to see spirits, both of adults and children, wandering the property. She spoke of a darkness that had attached itself to their family, a malevolent presence she was determined to fight. She purchased a book often referred to as the Satanic Bible, or a witch's Bible, not for worship, her pastor later clarified, but as a manual, a know thine enemy guide, to combat the evil she felt was encroaching upon them. She would perform strange rituals, painting cryptic messages and symbols on a storage container outside their home. One message, found after they vanished, read, "3 cats killed to date by people in this area. Witches don't like their black cat killed." Was it a symptom of her deteriorating mental state, or was she sensing something genuinely malevolent? The line had become terrifyingly blurred. And then there was Madison, age 6, a bright, happy little girl caught in the vortex of her parents' turmoil. She was the light of their lives, but she too was showing signs of the strain. She was reportedly withdrawn at school. At home, she told her mother she spoke to the spirit of a little girl who lived in her closet, a spirit with wings. A child's fantasy, perhaps. Or perhaps she was simply echoing the strange, paranoid reality her parents had constructed around her. The family was physically deteriorating as well. Friends who saw them shortly before they disappeared described them as emaciated. walking zombies. They seemed gaunt, underfed, and lost in a shared daze. They were planning to move, to escape. They had been looking at a 40-acre plot of land in the very same remote, rugged area of the Sans-Bois where their truck would be found. They spoke of wanting to live off the grid. In a storage container, they planned to move to the property, away from the prying eyes of society and the spirits that plagued their home. The most disturbing piece of this prelude to disaster was captured by the family's own home security camera. The footage from the day they left is silent, grainy, and one of the most chilling artifacts in the annals of true crime. It shows Bobby and Sherilyn moving back and forth from the house to the truck, over and over, in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. They don't speak. They don't look at each other. They move like people in a trance, their faces blank, their bodies rigid. They pack some items, then inexplicably unpack them, then pack them again. They stare off into the distance, as if listening to a voice no one else can hear. At one point, Sherilyn places a briefcase in the truck, her movements stiff and unnatural. Watching the footage is like watching a slow-motion possession. They are not a family preparing for a trip. They are people being compelled, moved like puppets on a string by some unseen force. The weight of their paranoia, their pain, and Sherilyn's belief in a spiritual war seems to hang in the very air, a visible, oppressive miasma. When they finally drove away from the house that day, they weren't just going to look at a piece of land. They were driving away from everything, propelled by a desperate, perhaps delusional, need to escape a darkness that, tragically, they were taking with them. Part 3. Into the Wilderness. The journey into the mountains was a journey into an endgame. They were heading for Red Oak Mountain, a place where cell service dies and the roads dissolve into rugged, unmarked trails. They had the cash, the $32,000, with them. The origin of the money remains a point of contention. Bobby had received a small settlement from his accident, but nothing near that amount. Sherilyn's mother had recently given them some money. Perhaps it was their life savings, every last cent they had, scraped together for a desperate final gamble on a new life. Or perhaps its origins were far more sinister. The prevailing theory among law enforcement, at least initially, was that the Jamesons were involved in the methamphetamine trade that plagued rural Oklahoma. The Sans-Bois Mountains were notorious as a haven for meth labs, isolated, difficult to police, and easy to defend. A large sum of cash, a meeting in a remote location, a family acting erratically. It fit the profile of a drug deal gone horribly, fatally wrong. Did they go to buy the land, or were they there to buy or sell drugs, using the land purchase as a cover? Did they cross the wrong people? People who would not hesitate to execute an entire family, child, and all over a deal gone bad. This theory explained the cash and the location. It could explain why they might have willingly left their truck. Perhaps they were led away at gunpoint. But it didn't fully align with the scene. If it was a violent drug-related murder, where was the evidence of a struggle? Where were the bodies? The vast, rugged terrain could hide them, of course, but the search was massive and thorough. The search for the Jamesons was one of the largest in Oklahoma history. Hundreds of volunteers on foot and on horseback combed the dense woods. K-9 units were brought in, their handlers hoping the dogs could pick up a scent. But here, another layer of high strangeness was added to the mystery. The dogs would track the family's scent from the truck, up the small hill, and then they would stop. Not just stop, but act strangely. Some would circle in confusion. Others would lie down, refusing to go any further, as if they had hit an invisible wall. It was profoundly bizarre, fueling speculation that the family hadn't walked away at all, but had perhaps been picked up in another vehicle. Yet there were no other tire tracks. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the story of the Jamesons became a local ghost story. The theories multiplied, each more unsettling than the last. Murder, suicide. Could the combined pressure of financial ruin, chronic pain, and mental illness have pushed one or both of the parents over the edge? Could Bobby, in a haze of pain and despair, or Sherilyn, in the grip of a psychotic break, have killed the family before taking their own life? It was possible, but it begged the question, why drive 30 miles into the wilderness to do it? And again, where were the remains? A person in such a state is unlikely to be meticulous about hiding 3 bodies. Lost and perished. The simplest explanation was often overlooked. Could they have simply gotten out of their truck for a walk to explore the land they dreamed of buying, become disoriented, and succumb to the elements? The Sans Bois are no gentle park. The terrain is treacherous, filled with ravines and thick underbrush. A twisted ankle, a sudden drop in temperature at night. It could be a death sentence for the unprepared. This would explain the lack of a struggle, but would it explain why they left their phones, their money, and their dog behind? Why not call for help? And would 3 bodies, even scattered by predators, remain unfound for so long in an area subjected to such an intense search? Cult or religious extremism. Sherilyn's spiritual warfare led investigators down a dark path. Was the family involved with a fringe religious group or a cult? Had they run afoul of them? Or was this a ritual of their own making? The strange symbols on the container, the talk of spirits, the witch's Bible, it all painted a picture of a family operating within a belief system far outside the mainstream. Perhaps their final act was one of twisted faith, a sacrifice, or a transcendental journey from which they never intended to return. And then there was the last photograph. Found on Sherilyn's cell phone, recovered from the truck, was a single picture taken on the mountain that day. It is a haunting, deeply disturbing image. It shows little Madison standing by the truck, her arms crossed, her expression not one of a happy child on an adventure, but of profound sadness, or perhaps fear. Her face is turned slightly away from the camera, her eyes downcast. She looks cold, alone, and utterly miserable. For many, this photo is the most terrifying clue of all. It is not a snapshot of a family outing. It feels like a farewell. It's the last known image of Madison Jamison alive, a tiny, poignant ghost, captured in a digital frame, her silent testimony to the terror of those final moments. The years passed. The truck was returned to the family. The case grew cold. The whispers in Latimer County never truly died, but they became part of the local folklore. The Jamison family had been claimed by the mountain, their story, a chilling campfire tale with no ending. The silence that followed their disappearance was absolute. Until November 2013, Part 4, Skeletons in the Dirt. 4 years and 1 month after the Jamisons' truck was found, a group of hunters on ATVs were exploring a thickly wooded, brutally remote spot, less than 3 miles from the site of the abandoned pickup. It was an area so inaccessible and rugged that it hadn't been covered in the initial ground search. There, scattered in the shallow depression of a dry creek bed, they found what was left of them, 3 partial skeletons. They were lying side by side, face down in the dirt. The Oklahoma State Medical Examiner's Office was called to the grim, lonely scene. The forest floor was carefully excavated. The remains were skeletal, ravaged by time, weather, and the creatures of the forest. Identifying them was difficult, but dental records and a few personal effects found nearby eventually provided a positive identification. It was Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. The discovery of the bodies answered the question of where they were, but it blew the question of what happened wide open, making it even more impenetrable. The official autopsy report was a study in frustration. The medical examiner, Dr. Andrew Sibley, could not determine a cause of death for any of them. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no bullet holes, no fractures from a blunt object. If they had been shot or stabbed, the evidence had long since been carried away by the elements. A toxicology report was impossible to conduct. The position of the bodies was perplexing. Lying side by side suggested they had died together, perhaps huddled for warmth as they succumbed to hypothermia. This lent credence to the lost and perished theory. But if that were the case, why were they found face down? And why would they have walked nearly 3 miles over some of the most difficult terrain in the area, away from the road, away from any hope of rescue? A small hole was found in the back of Bobby's skull. For a moment, it seemed like a smoking gun, a bullet hole. The family, especially Sherilyn's mother, seized on this, believing it proved they were murdered. It fit the narrative of a drug deal gone wrong, or an ambush by a local paranoid hiding out in the hills. However, the forensic anthropologist who examined the remains for the ME's office stated that the hole was just as likely, if not more likely, to be post-mortem damage from scavengers or the simple process of decay. The final report was blunt. Cause and manner of death for all three was undetermined. The mystery, instead of being solved, had simply found its final grim resting place. They hadn't been erased. They had died right there in the cold dirt, a stone's throw from where they left their lives behind. Conclusion: the unknowable darkness. The story of the Jameson family is a tapestry woven from threads of mental illness, chronic pain, poverty, paranoia, and possibly something much older and darker. The lack of a definitive answer is, in itself, the most horrifying part of the tale. It leaves a vacuum where our worst fears can fester. Did they fall victim to the brutal, violent world of the rural drug trade, their $32,000 the price of their lives? Did they simply get lost? A tragic but mundane explanation for a case that feels anything but. Did their shared psychosis, fueled by Sherilyn's belief in a spiritual war, lead them on a fatal pilgrimage into the wilderness, a final desperate attempt to flee the demons they carried in their own minds? Did they lie down together in that clearing, waiting for an escape that would only come in the form of death? Or is there another possibility, one that the rational mind rejects, but the whispering woods of the Sans-Bois seem to suggest? Did they encounter something in those mountains? The strange behavior of the tracking dogs, the trance-like state on the security camera, Sherilyn's conviction that they were being haunted. Could they have stumbled into a darkness that was not of their own making? A darkness that the ancient hills have harbored for centuries? We will never know. The only witnesses are the silent bones and the wind that sighs through the pines on Red Oak Mountain. The money, the letter, the strange security footage, and the haunting final photograph of a sad little girl are all that remain. They are puzzle pieces from different boxes, refusing to form a coherent picture. The Jameson family didn't just die, they dissolved. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that there are still places where the map ends, where the comforting logic of our world frays and unravels. It shows us that the most terrifying monsters are often not the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones that reside in the human heart, and the unanswerable questions that are left behind like echoes in the wilderness, long after the screams have faded. The Sans-Bois Mountains keep their secrets, and the ghosts of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jameson have become their most haunting and eternal one. The Shadows of Mounds High. There are places in America that time has forgotten, hollowed-out husks left behind by the relentless march of progress. They exist in a perpetual state of twilight, their stories fading like old photographs bleached by the sun. Mounds, Illinois, is one such place. Nestled in the humid floodplain where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers conspire to meet, the town is a ghost of its former self. Once a bustling railroad hub, its arteries of steel now lie silent and rusted. The clapboard houses sag, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at streets that have more memories than traffic. It was this profound sense of decay, this palpable weight of history that drew us there. My name is Alex Corbin, and I lead a small, dedicated team of paranormal researchers called Ethereal Echoes. We're not the ghost-hunting thrill seekers you see on television, chasing cheap scares with night vision cameras. We are historians of the unseen, archivists of the residual. Our team consists of 3 core members: myself, the lead investigator and historian; Ben Carter, our tech savant and resident skeptic, armed with a pragmatist's mind and an arsenal of custom-built equipment; and Maya Singh, our sensitive, a woman with an unnerving ability to feel the emotional imprint left on a location. For years, we had heard the whispers about mounds, specifically about the old high school. It wasn't just another haunted building. The stories that bled out of that place were darker, more cohesive, and more terrifying than the usual tales of disembodied footsteps and spectral ladies in white. They spoke of shadow people, not just one, but a legion of them. They spoke of a building so saturated with sorrow and fear that it had become a blight, a wound on the landscape that refused to heal. The Mounds Meridian High School, a hulking brick monolith built in the 1920s, had been abandoned for decades. It stood on a low rise overlooking the town, a silent, brooding king on a throne of weeds and broken concrete. After years of petitions, paperwork, and navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of a near-defunct township, we were finally granted a 48-hour lockdown investigation. For us, this was the Everest of Midwestern hauntings. We arrived on a sweltering afternoon in late August. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth, river water, and decay. As we pulled up, the school loomed over us. Its brick facade was stained black with grime, and nearly every one of its hundreds of windows was either shattered or boarded up. A chain-link fence, sagging and rusted, offered a pathetic defense against intruders. The only sound was the drone of cicadas, a high-pitched, incessant thrum that felt like the sound of anxiety itself. "Well, she's a beaut, Clark," Ben quipped, his usual gallows humor a thin shield against the oppressive atmosphere. He was already unloading Pelican cases filled with thermal imagers, EMF meters, parabolic microphones, and his prized possession, a full-spectrum camera he'd modified himself. Maya, however, was silent. She stood beside our van, her arms wrapped around herself despite the heat. Her gaze was fixed on the third floor of the main building. "What is it, May?" I asked, my voice low. "It's loud," she whispered, her eyes wide. "So much noise, so many voices all at once. It's like a crowd screaming, but without a sound." I knew that feeling. It was the precursor to a significant haunting. A place doesn't just hold energy. If the concentration is strong enough, it broadcasts it. And Mounds High was broadcasting on every damn frequency. The caretaker, a wiry old man named Earl, whose family had lived in Mounds for 5 generations, met us at the gate. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his eyes held the weary resignation of someone who has lived alongside a monster for too long. "Got your waiver?" he grunted, not making eye contact. I handed him the signed document. He unlocked the heavy chain on the gate. "Lock it behind you when you go in. I ain't coming back till 10 a.m. Sunday. You got 2 full nights, more than most can handle." "Have you been inside recently, Earl?" I asked. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were like chips of flint. "Haven't set foot past that doorway in 20 years. Not since my brother. Not since he helped clear it out back when it closed. He saw things, said the shadows in there. They move. They watch." He shook his head, a gesture of finality. "Place is sick. Rotten from the inside out. Good luck to you." With that, he got in his rust-pocked pickup truck and drove off, leaving us alone with the behemoth. The moment we stepped inside, the world changed. The oppressive summer heat vanished, replaced by a damp, cellar-like cold that had nothing to do with the laws of thermodynamics. The air was thick with the smell of mold, wet plaster, and something else. Something acrid and metallic, like old blood or rust. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the beams of our flashlights, a silent, swirling cosmos in the gloom. Our footsteps echoed unnervingly in the main hall. Lockers, dented and graffitied, lined the walls like rows of steel coffins. Their doors hung open at odd angles, like gaping mouths. We established our base camp in the old administrative office just off the main entrance, a room with fewer broken windows and a door that could be propped shut. Ben immediately went to work, a whirlwind of cables and monitors. "Okay, I'm setting up 4 DVR cams," he announced, his voice a bubble of normalcy in the suffocating silence. "1 here at base, 1 covering the main hall, 1 at the auditorium entrance, and 1 pointed up the main stairwell. Full spectrum and thermal running in parallel. We'll have a live feedback here." While he worked, Maya and I did an initial walkthrough. The school was a labyrinth of decay. In the classrooms, old textbooks lay swollen and moldering on the floor, their pages fused into solid blocks. Desks were overturned, some with childish carvings still visible on their surfaces. Initials inside a heart, a crudely drawn rocket ship. It was a Pompeii of forgotten youth. "The sadness here is a physical weight," Maya said, her hand trailing along the grimy tile of a hallway wall. "Generations of it. Teenage heartbreak, anxiety over tests, bullying. It's all soaked into the walls. But there's something else. Something sharp. Fear. Pure, undiluted terror. We reached the auditorium at the end of the west wing. The great double doors were closed. I pushed one open, and it groaned on its hinges, the sound echoing like a dying man's last breath. The cavernous space was pitch black. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows upon rows of seats, their red velvet upholstery ripped and covered in dust. On the stage, the grand curtain was tattered, hanging in strips like dried flesh. A sudden, sharp bang from the stage made all three of us jump. Ben, having just joined us, immediately raised his K2 meter. The lights on the device, which had been dormant green, flashed wildly into the red. EMF spike, a big one, he stated, his voice tight. Right from the center of the stage. What was that noise? Maya whispered, her eyes locked on the stage. Sounded like one of the seatbacks slamming down, I reasoned, trying to find a rational explanation. Probably a draft? Or a rat? There's no draft in here, Alex, Ben countered. The air is dead still, and a rat doesn't set off an EMF meter like that. We stood in silence for a long moment, listening. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart. Then, from the darkness of the stage, came another sound, a soft, rhythmic creaking. The sound of a single rope, swaying back and forth, back and forth. It was a sound that didn't belong, a ghost of emotion in the stagnant air. We backed out of the auditorium slowly, pulling the heavy door shut. The energy in the main hall felt different now, charged and aware. It was no longer just a building. It felt like we had disturbed something's slumber. As dusk bled through the grimy windows, painting the hallways in shades of orange and deep purple, the school truly began to wake up. We decided to begin our formal investigation on the second floor, a wing of classrooms and science labs. Ben had his array of gear, I had my digital recorder and notepad, and Maya was our barometer for the unseen. We entered a former chemistry lab. Broken beakers and glass tubing littered the floor like jagged ice. The long black-topped lab tables were still in place. Ask something, Alex, Maya urged, her focus on a dark corner near the fume hoods. It's strong here. A child, a girl. She's scared. I held up my digital recorder. Is there anyone here with us? I asked, my voice steady. We're not here to harm you. We just want to understand your story. We waited in silence. The only reply was the distant groan of the building settling. My name is Alex, I continued. This is Ben and Maya. Can you tell us your name? Nothing. Ben was sweeping the room with a thermal camera. Got a cold spot over here, he said, pointing to the corner Maya had been staring at. Ambient is 72 degrees. This spot is 55. He walked over, the camera trained on the empty space. As he did, a small glass vial on a shelf next to the corner vibrated for a second and then fell to the floor, shattering with a tinkling crash. Ben swore and jumped back. Okay, that was not a coincidence. I knelt and looked at the broken glass. Maya, can you get a name? Maya closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah, she breathed. She's afraid of the man in the basement, the janitor. He was mean. He used to lock kids in the supply closets. A janitor. It was a common trope in school ghost stories, but here, coming from Maya, it felt chillingly authentic. Sarah, I said to the empty air, you don't have to be afraid of him anymore. He can't hurt you. As soon as the words left my mouth, a sound echoed up from the floors below. A heavy, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of a metal shovel being dragged across a concrete floor. It came from the direction of the basement. Ben and I exchanged a look. The sound was clear, deliberate, and deeply menacing. He knows we're talking about him, Maya whispered, her face pale. The scraping stopped. A moment later, a door slammed shut somewhere deep in the building, the sound booming through the school like a gunshot. It was a declaration, an assertion of dominance. The rest of the night was a cascade of escalating activity. In the library, books flew off shelves, not just falling, but launching themselves with violent force. We captured a clear EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, of a child's sob, followed by a low, guttural whisper that the analysis software later translated as mine. But the true harbingers of the haunting's deeper nature were the shadows. It started with fleeting glimpses in our peripheral vision, a flicker of movement at the end of a long corridor, a shape darting through a doorway, too quick to register. But as the night wore on, they grew bolder. Ben was the first to see one clearly. He was in the gymnasium, a vast, echoing space with a polished wooden floor. He had set up a laser grid, a matrix of green laser dots that would be disturbed by any physical object passing through it. He was monitoring it from the bleachers when he saw it. He called us on the walkie-talkie, his voice strained. "Alex, you need to see this, now." Maya and I rushed to the gym. We found Ben staring, mesmerized, at the far side of the court. His laser grid was active, a shimmering green net in the darkness. "Watch," he said, pointing. We waited. For a full minute, there was nothing. Then, a section of the laser grid near the far wall simply vanished. The green dots winked out, as if something solid were standing in front of them, blocking the light. But there was nothing there, just an empty space where a man-shaped void had appeared. "It's absorbing the light," Ben breathed, his skepticism vaporizing before my eyes. "It's not casting a shadow. It is a shadow." As we watched, the void began to move. It glided along the wall, silent and fluid, a patch of absolute blackness against the lesser dark of the gym. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and vaguely humanoid, but it had no discernible features. It was a silhouette cut out of the fabric of reality. The sight was profoundly unnatural. It wasn't like seeing a ghost, a transparent, shimmering figure. This was different. It felt ancient and predatory. It moved with a purpose that was chilling. After traversing half the length of the gym wall, it flowed into a corner and was gone. The laser dots reappeared as if nothing had happened. "That's one of them," Maya said, her voice barely audible. "They're not all the same. That one felt old, a watcher." By 4 a.m., we were emotionally and physically drained. The activity had been relentless, a constant barrage on the senses. We retreated to our base camp in the office, nursing coffee and adrenaline. We reviewed the footage. It was stunning. The camera in the main hall had captured a shadow figure, identical to the one we saw in the gym, peering into our office before retreating back into the darkness. We had hours of EVPs, from whispers and cries to a deep, menacing laugh that made the hair on my arms stand up. "This place isn't just haunted, Alex," Ben said, staring at the monitor. "It's infested, and whatever that thing is, that shadow, it feels like the one in charge." I thought of the janitor Maya had mentioned. "The man from the basement," I said. "Maybe that's him." "No," Maya corrected, shaking her head. "The janitor, his name was Silas. He's here. He's the one who scrapes the shovel. He's the one who slams the doors. He's cruel and he's loud, but he's not the shadow we saw. The shadow is something else, something older. Silas is afraid of it too." The idea of one ghost being afraid of another was a terrifying concept. It implied a hierarchy, a food chain. The second night, we decided to push back. We would focus our investigation on the 2 most active and spiritually opposed areas, the 3rd floor classrooms, where the child spirits like Sarah seemed to congregate, and the basement, the domain of the janitor, Silas. We split up, a decision I would come to regret for the rest of my life. Maya and I went to the 3rd floor, Ben insisting he could handle it and wanting to get to the source of the mechanical sounds and EMF spikes, descended into the basement. We maintained constant radio contact. The 3rd floor felt different from the rest of the school. The oppressive menace was still present, a low hum beneath the surface. But here, the primary emotion was a profound, heartbreaking sadness. We set up in a classroom where a small child-sized desk stood alone in the center of the room. "Sarah, are you here?" Maya asked softly. "We want to help you." We used the spirit box, a device that rapidly scans radio frequencies, creating white noise that spirits can theoretically use to form words. For a while, we got nothing but static. Then a clear, high-pitched voice came through, a single, plaintive word: cold. My blood ran chill. "We know," I said into the silence. "Sarah, what are you afraid of?" The spirit box crackled. A series of disjointed words came through. "Dark, man, down, stairs, hurts." "Silas?" I asked. No, the tiny voice replied, clear as a bell. Shadow. Suddenly, my walkie-talkie crackled to life. It was Ben, but it wasn't his voice. It was a sound of pure panic, a strangled gasp, followed by a loud crash and the sound of metal clattering on concrete. Ben? Ben, respond, I yelled into the radio. Only static answered. We have to go, I said to Maya, already on my feet. Something's happened to him. We scrambled out of the classroom and into the hall, and that's when we saw it. At the far end of the corridor, standing in the deep gloom where our flashlights couldn't quite reach, was a figure. It wasn't the fluid, gliding shadow from the gym. This one was different. It was denser, more solid, and it seemed to radiate an almost visible cold. It was the shape of a large man, but its form was distorted, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. This was not a memory or an imprint. This was a presence, a malevolent intelligence. As it began to move towards us, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. I could see my breath fogging in the air. The fluorescent light fixtures above us, long dead, began to flicker erratically, buzzing and sparking, as if a massive electrical charge were passing through the air. This wasn't Silas. This was what Silas was afraid of. Alex, Maya whimpered, grabbing my arm. She was paralyzed, her face a mask of terror. The figure didn't walk. It drifted, but with a terrifying weight, its non-existent feet seeming to drag on the floor. With every foot it advanced, the shadows in the hallway seemed to deepen and stretch, pulled towards it like iron filings to a magnet. It was a vortex of negation, a black hole in the shape of a man. I pulled Maya back, shoving her behind me. "Get out of here!" I screamed at the approaching darkness, my voice cracking. It was a primal, instinctual reaction. The figure paused. It was perhaps 50 feet away. It had no face, no eyes, but I felt its attention fix on me, a pressure in my mind that was physically painful. The air grew thick, hard to breathe. The joyful ghosts of children, the sorrowful echoes of teenage life, all of it was gone, snuffed out by this single, overwhelming presence. Then a sound came from it. Not a voice, but a psychic projection of a sound, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in my bones and seemed to say, "Leave!" It was a command backed by an ancient and absolute authority. My survival instinct screamed at me to run, but Ben was in the basement. I couldn't leave him. "Maya, go! Get to the office! Barricade the door!" I yelled, pushing her towards the stairs. She hesitated. Then, seeing the look in my eyes, she turned and fled. Now it was just me and the thing in the hall. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The figure raised a long, shadowy arm and pointed a finger at me. And in that moment, I felt a despair so profound, so absolute, that it brought me to my knees. It was the feeling of utter hopelessness, the certainty that all light and warmth were lies, and that the only truth was this cold, empty darkness. My flashlight flickered and died. The emergency lights in the hall died. I was plunged into absolute blackness, alone with the entity. I could hear it getting closer, a soft, dragging sound. I fumbled for the heavy iron railroad spike I always carry for protection, a token of grounding, of solid reality. I clutched it in my hand, its cold, hard weight a small anchor in a sea of terror. Just as I thought it was upon me, a sound cut through the darkness from the opposite end of the hall. It was the faint, clear sound of a little girl crying. Sarah. The shadow figure stopped. Its attention shifted. For a split second, its oppressive presence lessened. It was just the opening I needed. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not back towards the stairs Maya had taken, but towards the secondary stairwell at the far end of the hall, the one that led down past the auditorium and towards the boiler room entrance. I half fell, half ran down the concrete steps, my boots echoing in the stairwell. I burst into the ground floor hallway and sprinted towards the heavy metal door that led to the basement. It was slightly ajar. "Ben!" I bellowed, throwing the door open. The stench of stagnant water, rust, and ozone hit me. The basement was a nightmare of pipes and machinery. My backup flashlight cut a weak beam through the oppressive dark. I found Ben near the massive, defunct boiler. He was on the ground, his equipment scattered around him. His face was ashen, and he was breathing in ragged gasps. His K2 meter was lying next to him, its plastic casing cracked, the lights dark. "Alex," he rasped, pointing a shaking finger towards the far side of the boiler. It was right there, the janitor, Silas. I saw his face. He was laughing. Lying on the floor near where Ben was pointing was a heavy coal-stained shovel, the source of the scraping sound. "We have to go, now," I said, helping him to his feet. As we stumbled back towards the stairs, a door at the far end of the basement slammed shut, with enough force to shake the pipes overhead. A low guttural chuckle echoed in the darkness, a sound full of malice and glee. It was Silas. He was toying with us. We didn't stop running until we were back in the relative safety of our office. Maya was there, huddled in a corner, crying silently. We barricaded the door with an old metal desk and collapsed, panting and trembling. We didn't try to investigate further. We didn't need to. We had come for evidence of a haunting and had stumbled into a war. The rest of the night, we sat in that small office, listening to the sounds of the school. We heard Silas dragging his shovel up and down the main hall. We heard the disembodied cries of children from the upper floors. And underneath it all, we felt the silent, patient, watchful presence of the thing on the third floor, the true master of Mounds High. When the first rays of dawn finally pierced the grimy windows, it felt like a physical rescue. The oppressive atmosphere lessened, the sounds ceased, and the building returned to a state of mere decay. We packed our essential gear in a frantic rush, leaving behind several cameras and stands. It didn't matter. All we wanted was to get out. As we stepped out into the morning light, the humid air that had felt so oppressive 2 days ago now felt clean and life-giving. We didn't look back. In the weeks that followed, we analyzed the data we had managed to salvage. The evidence was staggering. We had clear video of the shadow figures, audio of Silas's laugh and the child's voice, and telemetry data showing impossible temperature drops and electromagnetic fields. Ben's personal recorder had captured the sound of his fall, preceded by a harsh, raspy voice whispering, "You don't belong here." We had our proof. Mounds High was not just haunted. It was a complex ecosystem of the damned. There were the lost souls, the children like Sarah, trapped in an endless loop of their own fear and sadness. There was the malevolent human spirit, Silas, a cruel bully in life who had become a petty tyrant in death, feeding on the fear he created. And then there were the shadow people. We concluded they weren't ghosts of people at all. They were something else, something older and far more sinister. Perhaps they were drawn to the nexus of pain and misery that the school had become. Perhaps they created it. The one in the gym was a scout, a watcher. But the one on the third floor, that was something else entirely. It was a warden, a shepherd of sorrow, a being that fed on despair. It was the true heart of the darkness in Mounds. The Mounds Meridian High School was finally demolished a few years after our investigation. They tore it down, brick by brick, and trucked the rubble away. They built a small community park on the land, with a swing set and a cheerful plastic slide. But you cannot demolish a memory. You cannot bulldoze a stain. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, the people who live near that park say they can still hear the faint sound of a school bell ringing in the empty air. And some claim that on the darkest nights, the shadows that fall from the park's streetlights seem a little too long, a little too dark, and for a fleeting moment, they almost look like they're moving.